Hello and welcome to another video for ENT 210. There are a couple of things I want to talk about in this video. Firstly, there are several recurring themes throughout this class and I just want to bring your attention to them. Number one, there are tensions with all human beings that we have to rationalize and come to terms with. Some of these influence our motivation to be creative. Some of these kinds of tensions you're also familiar with. Anybody that's been in real estate will attest to the fact that people will come in and say, I want to buy a house that is kind of in a good school district. Want it near the town centre. Maybe we can reduce the number of cars we have because I can walk to some of the places I want to go to. Various other criteria. We don't want a very big backyard because of the upkeep, those kinds of things. And I have a friend that is in real estate who rants about this on a regular basis, and he just came the other day to a meeting with us, and he was obviously a bit frustrated about something, and he said, you know, he had exactly that situation. He got a brief from a client, this is what they wanted, ran into them about 6 weeks later, and they were elated, they just bought a house. And he was a little frustrated by that because he put a lot of effort into showing them houses. And when they got talking, they bought a ranch house quite a way outside Reno with kind of enough space in the backyard for a horse and various other things. I mean, it was nothing like the brief that they'd given them. So it's not unusual to see human beings make kind of a rational decision on the one hand, and come to and then really take a course of action that is totally different to that. And to some extent, I think you can put this down to the two ways that we look at things. Sometimes we look at things very rationally, and you know, we have a set of scales and we say, well, this is the pros and this is the cons, and we come to some sort of nebulous conclusion as a function of that. Other times we will just our emotions take over and we just say, I want to do this or I want to do that, and that's the end of it. And interestingly, and this really goes right back to some of the research and writings of Freud, it has been found that in terms of large important decisions, there is a tendency for us to kind of think these are the ones that should be treated in a very rational kind of pros and cons sort of basis. The reality is that people's decisions tend to be better in the sense of being more satisfying to them, and the chance when you analyze it of having a more positive outcome. With large complicated decisions, you're best off actually making the decision from an emotional basis. You can gather all the data together for sure, but the pros and cons process seems better suited to smaller, less important decisions. And that may be counterintuitive. What it does do, though, is it tends to, the fact that it's counterintuitive is that we do not fully appreciate how much is going on in our brains when we're not contemplating something. And this is important in creativity because sometimes you will have a decision to make, or you're thinking about something complex. And if you have the opportunity of what I call putting it in your top drawer for a few weeks, in other words, absorb the problem and absorb the data you've got around that problem, and then get on with your life, do something else. And then when you get back to it, you will find that there's a much higher chance of getting to a creative solution than if you had just stuck with the problem in the first place and just thought it through and thought it through and thought it through. That is a very unsatisfactory process. So we call this, in the world of creativity, we call this incubation. And it is that sort of, sometimes people call it passive learning, and all it really is giving that staggeringly powerful, but not in the same way that your laptop is, that staggeringly powerful computer that's sitting on top of our shoulders. It's giving it the opportunity of taking that data and taking the problem or the question or the dilemma and it is churning through all sorts of different things, not just as a computer might, looking at all the various permutations of the data, but it's also comparing it to our history, to how we have looked at problems in the past, how other people might have addressed the same problem, how other people have had outcomes that have been either positive or negative through making certain types of decision in a certain way. So anyway, that's just a little bit of an aside, but this process of incubation is something that is going to go on in the discussion that goes on in one of the videos for the week. So I think it's a pretty interesting topic to talk about, actually, and one that's very, because it is a new subject, it's one that has not been subject to very much research. So first, there are tensions that all human beings have to rationalize and come to terms with. Second, there are contradictions at the societal level that either promote or undermine creativity, both at the individual level and at the organizational level. There are two individual level tensions that you've come across so far in this class. One is from my group affiliation model of creativity, and this deals with the tension between our need for the company of others versus our need for our own individuality, personal space, if you will. The second came from Csikszentmihalyi, who you might have been wondering how to pronounce that name. The one that's spelt Csikszentmihalyi. Well, it's actually pronounced, it's Hungarian, it's pronounced Csikszentmihalyi. He suggests that each of us is born with two contradictory sets of instructions. A conservative tendency made up of instincts for self-preservation, self-aggrandizement, energy saving, and an expansive tendency made up of instincts for exploring, for enjoying novelty and risk. The curiosity that leads to creativity belongs to this set. So, in a sense, on the one hand, you've got this very conservative, looking towards just maintaining the status quo, and on the other, you have this exploratory need. These are both very important to our discussions throughout this class. So I want you to take a few minutes and think about them in detail. Pause the video, see if you can figure out how you have experienced these two sets of opposing drives. Firstly, for individuality versus group affiliation, and secondly, these two drives, one to the safe road and the other the exploratory road. And share your thoughts with your cohort on the student forum if you wish. Okay, the other contradiction is talked about, particularly at the organizational level, is the conflict between creativity, and thus, of course, innovation, and organization. As Richard Florida mentions in the Rise of the Creative Class, the great Austrian economist you may have heard of if you've done any business classes, Joseph Schumpeter, talks about the importance of the entrepreneur and describes them as capitalists' greatest strength. He then goes on to predict their demise as bureaucratized industrial giants gobble up smaller businesses and their owners and oust entrepreneurs, crushing innovation out of the organizational world and replacing it by organizational structure. Now, Schumpeter died in 1950, and had he lived, I think he would have had to agree that his prediction was somewhat overgloomy. Examination of cities such as Boston, Portland, Austin, San Francisco's Silicon Valley, of course, Atlanta, and many others, reveals that entrepreneurship is very much alive and well, with startups and already made it that are often the innovative feeder fish upon which mega corporations thrive. Nonetheless, Schumpeter's fear is not without base. Consider that between 1908 and 1940, Sears, Roebuck and Company sold 7,000 homes through their iconic catalogue. In 1886, Richard Sears, who was a railroad station agent in Minneapolis, started selling gold watches at $14 a piece. Just under 8 years later, he was the publisher of a 322-page mail-order catalogue, which offered medical and veterinary supplies, musical instruments, firearms, bicycles, sewing machines, baby buggies, and of course, houses. Why then did Sears Roebuck and Company file for bankruptcy in 2018 rather than becoming the Amazon? Consider that it wasn't until 1924 that Sears opened its first retail store. So since their inception in 1886 to 1924, all they did was mail order, and then they opened their first retail store. Mail order at that time was beginning to slow a little because of the advent of the automobile. So people's transport went up, and suddenly shopping and so forth, the original mall wasn't built yet, but going to shops and so forth suddenly was kind of a little bit more available to people and probably a little bit more exciting. By 1968, when it was officially renamed The Wish Book, the Sears catalogue still played a major role in the business, boasting 225 pages of toys and 380 pages of gifts for adults, for a grand total of 650 pages. That's a lot of catalogue. However, the catalogue division was finally closed in 1993. So part of why Sears did not become Amazon has to be that the leadership perceived that catalogue marketing was a thing of the past. Another part of the answer may be that they simply did not see the internet as a rival of the catalogue sales model. Part of the answer may also be that doing more of the same had become the large organizational business model for success. Now contemplate that the World Wide Web was officially born in 1989, and it was open to commercial use in 1991. So even though e-commerce as we know it was nearly a decade in the future, this was all so close to the demise of Sears' catalogue business that I find it hard to believe that a leadership and management structure open to new ideas could not have foreseen the marketing possibilities of the web, even if they did not foresee it as a transactional platform. Structure crushing creativity? Perhaps so. The point I'm making is that when businesses become very large, and you see this often with small entrepreneurial startups that suddenly get to some sort of a critical mass, and it's almost as if people sort of scratch their heads and say, we can't just bumble along like a bunch of geeks, we now have to turn this into a real company. And they start imposing structure. And sometimes their first idea around which the company was based was their last. And it's a real dilemma as to quite why all this happens, but over and over again, research has shown that this happens. In other words, innovative companies suddenly flatline as the whole process. Innovation seems to go out of the business. And I suggest, and this is really supported by a lot of research, that this is the implementation of structure. The other thing I want to talk about very briefly is brainstorming. Brainstorming is a very important part of the business world of creativity and innovation. But it's not just that. I mean, we ourselves brainstorm. We brainstorm individually. If we've got a number of different choices, we'll tend to sort of chew them over in a very brainstormy kind of way. If we have a problem, we'll look at different solutions, try and come up with different solutions. So it is not just an organizational phenomenon. One of the very interesting things, and it's a bit of an embarrassment to the business world, so you don't even hear this talked about much at management conferences, but renegades like myself bring it up on a regular basis just to attempt to make people realize that this is a real issue. The strange phenomenon is that if you get a bunch of people around the table to generate inventive, creative ideas regarding the solution of a problem, they will typically do a worse job than if that same bunch of ideas had gone away to think of ideas on their own. So in other words, individual brainstorming seems to be much more effective than group-oriented brainstorming. And I'm going to pose a question for you. If you had in the back of your mind the group affiliation model of creativity, why do you think this shortcoming might be? Why do you think that a group of people brainstorming will be less effective than individuals? I'll give you a few seconds to think about that. And if you want more time, just pause the video. Okay, well, think about what the group affiliation model tells us. It tells us that anything that we do to push people from the individual aspect of the individual drive, the drive we have for individualism, anything we do to try and move them from that to a group-oriented mode, to a kind of mental process where we are with other people. In other words, where the group is important to us rather than our own singularity. Anything we do to do that will tend to reduce our creativity, because creativity is a function of our being unique. It is a function of our thinking as individuals, not as group members. And what are you doing in brainstorming? You're getting a group of people together to essentially tackle the same issue. In other words, you are creating a group or a team, whatever you want to call it. So what are you going to do? Well, that in itself is going to reduce the creativity of the members of the group. So that's an important kind of function. And there are a number of different ways that you'll read about in my book where that can be solved. There are a number of different solutions that people have talked about. And for instance, a group of people sitting around the table throwing out ideas will often be dominated by one or two vocal people. And the quieter, perhaps more introverted members of the team will tend to sit back, because that's what introverted people do when they're in a team. Sometimes there are people called freeloading who will simply think and say to themselves, you know, everybody seems to be doing a great job here. I really don't need to be thinking about this at all. And they'll wander off and think about tomorrow's shopping list or whatever it is. So there are a whole range of different processes. Sometimes there will be a member of the team, quite often in fact, who is a superior, who's the boss perhaps, or something like that. Maybe they're even the facilitator of the brainstorming group, which is never a good idea, but it often happens. Well, then you have a power differential between group members, and that will often dissuade certain group members from saying anything. So basically there are a whole range of reasons why group affiliation, why brainstorming has not really lived up to its original promises. They have all been tried in research. Various techniques have been used to try and eliminate them as the source of the problem, and still the issue persisted that brainstorming as a group is less efficient than it is as an individual, on an individual basis. So that's really why group affiliation is probably the more satisfactory answer. So anyway, group activities such as that have a tendency to reduce creativity, but you know, there are techniques where we can kind of accommodate that and attempt to get around that problem, not least of which is that the stages of brainstorming and creative problem solving that involve generating novel ideas, we try and, when I'm conducting brainstorming, I will have people wander off on their own. I mean, I don't want them anywhere near any other members of the team, or preferably nowhere near anybody else. So, you know, if I'm conducting this in a sort of rural environment, I'll send everybody off in different directions with a pad and paper and say, great, think about ideas. What possible ways can we have of solving this problem? And then I'll have them come back, sit around the table, and they should have, each of them, a piece of paper with a number of ideas written on it. And two things are important there. One is that they've gone off and done the ideation, as we call it, the generation of the ideas individually, not influenced by other people around them. And the second important function is that they've written it down. So, for instance, if they find that somebody else has come up with a good idea and they think, well, mine's not quite as good as that, so I'm not going to say anything about it. You actually have got written proof that they also have ideas. So I also get people to switch around their pieces of paper, put them in a big heap, and then you all take somebody else's sheet of paper. You don't know whose it is, and you will read from that. So you've got no ownership in what's written in front of you. You have an obligation to mention everything on that list, and so people can't hide behind. They can't sort of think, oh, his idea is better than mine, I'm not going to say anything with mine, or start talking about one particular person's ideas to the exclusion of others. So any of you that have done brainstorming, talk about that in your student forum, because it can produce some pretty extreme results. I mean, before I started doing what I do now, I went to brainstorming sessions that were, well, tedious was just an understatement, frankly, very unproductive, and so on and so forth. Now, brainstorming, in the way that I'm talking about it, is really only one part of the creative problem-solving process. And depending on who you talk to, you'll get a whole range of different models of what creative problem-solving is. But basically, as you'll see in my book, creative problem-solving has a number of different stages. Firstly, an important stage is actually making sure that you're looking at the right question to ask. So, for instance, if you are your company is kind of not making enough money, you might say, okay guys, let's get together, I want to have a brainstorming session on how can we get more sales. Okay, that's certainly one way to tackle the issue. However, that might not be the most immediately productive question to ask. You might have another question, such as, how can we reduce costs? How can we increase efficiency? How can we do a whole range of different things? So, in a sense, you need, to do this job properly, you really need several different stages of generating ideas. And one of those stages, the first stage really is a problem finding stage. And I don't like to use the word problem all the time, like creative problem solving, because it's not always about problems. Sometimes it's about, very positive things that are have a much more interesting appeal than the idea of just solving problems the whole time. But because everybody else is going to use it, I will use it as well. So problem finding, which also has one of these idea generating stages. And idea generating stages, that is what we call a divergent part of the process. That is where we're trying to open our minds to all sorts of different ways that we can think about something, generating solutions perhaps from different domains, okay, so different fields, different kind of ways of looking. So that's why everything goes at this stage. Now then, at some point you have to take these ideas and eliminate the ones that don't seem either practical or don't seem to have as positive an outcome as some of the others. And that's what we call the convergent stage, okay? That's if you want, if you go from a divergent stage to a convergent stage, or to you it would be the other way around. So, in other words, you're coming together at this point. You are funneling down. So you're not trying to expand your thought as much as to focus these ideas so that you end up with a manageable number that you can really explore. So that occurs at the problem finding stage, and then as you go a little further into the process, that will also occur into the solution finding stage. So let's say you've got this issue of your business is not making enough money. You have decided that increasing efficiency might be the most productive question to ask at this point. So then your ideation stage is, how can we possibly increase efficiency? So then once again you're at your divergent stage. You're now opening your mind to think of every possible way that you might be able to increase efficiency. And then you go through the convergent stage as well, where you're focusing your mind on which of those many solutions, this whiteboard full of different ideas, how many of them you can get rid of. So typically you will sort of group these things. So certain of the ideas that people come up with can be positioned in certain groups. So you might have perhaps 8 groups of ideas or something like that. So certain of those groups might be, the time frame might be too long, or they might require too many resources, or all sorts of different things. Eventually you'll end up with a very small number, and those you can tease right through to a planning stage. And then one of those will stand out. You don't necessarily have to follow just one of those. You can follow 1, 2, 3, however many it takes. But generally speaking, it will be some very small number. And more often or not, it will be just one idea that you're going to follow, initially anyway. So you might have a backup that you'll follow a little bit later if the first one doesn't produce what you need it to, or you think it might produce advantages over and above the first one. So basically then you have this planning stage. And then after the planning stage, you have the implementation stages. So in the model that I use, we're really talking about a circle with 4 quadrants in it. So you're going to have problem finding, and then you're going to have the ideation stage, the solution finding. Then those are going to be honed down to the planning stage, and then the implementation stage. So, and sometimes these cycles tend to go round and round. Maybe there'll be a problem that comes up in the planning stage that you have to go back to the drawing board, create another idea to solve that. So sometimes you'll find that the creative part, the ideation part, will occur in several different quadrants. But as you might imagine, these 4 quadrants actually do use different skills, and different people have different kind of personality attributes that will make them better at one section than the other. So that's important as well. So sometimes your team will change. If you've got highly creative, highly ideational people doing the planning, they might duck out. They might say, you know what, I'm going to leave you guys to this, because planning of this type is really not my bag. And similarly, implementation. I mean, we've got certain types of human dynamo that are very, very good at implementing things. So that can be a very interesting kind of perspective as well. So anyway, that's 2 things that I think are very important. Just wanted to catch up on the recurring themes of this duality that we have as human beings, where opposing forces can be very evident. And just to talk a little bit about the importance of brainstorming. Now, one thing that I should just emphasize is that brainstorming and creative problem solving, these are not silver bullets. When they were dreamt up by the owner of a very big advertising agency, it was kind of thought that they were going to really put that particular advertising agency way ahead of everybody else, because of these enormous number of exciting ideas that were going to happen, and that didn't happen, and that was a great frustration to everybody at the time. But the point is that really, if you want creative ideas, brainstorming is a proxy for, if you like, doing the job properly. Doing the job properly, in my book, is to have creativity as a grassroots phenomenon within your organization, a core value. So an organization, for instance, that's sort of founded on old management methods, where you have a very kind of top-down decision-making process, and very little kind of conversation going from line level up to upper management, those kinds of things, you start to try and bolt creativity onto that, and it becomes often a very fruitless or temporary exercise, sometimes with some very expensive mistakes built into that. As you get more contemporary organizations, where you have a much flatter decision-making kind of process, so many more layers in the organization are actually already involved in decision-making. And that is much more conducive to creativity coming from the ground up, grassroots level creativity. Because when you think about it, unless you're talking about something incredibly complex or esoteric, in most organizations, everybody in the organization has some kind of input they can offer. in some companies, those people themselves will be potential customers. So they're not just employees. So, as Toyota found when they put suggestion boxes in their organizations, they were anticipating, sort of 50, 100 kind of different suggestions per month or something. Once this thing had got established, they were getting 10,000 suggestions a month. I mean, it was completely overwhelming. One of the reasons for that, of course, is that everybody drives a car. So, everybody had the capacity to look at Toyota's products in a way that was useful. So I'm not saying all of those suggestions were necessarily useful, but the point is people were very, very keen to come forward with those suggestions. So that's the kind of thing that is genuine grassroots creativity, and that's really what we're striving for and what is gradually happening. Those videos you've seen of sort of very interesting, playful kind of environments to work in are attempts to achieve just that kind of thing. So brainstorming, although it's very useful and is definitely has positive advantages in certain circumstances, is not the same thing as developing a grassroots core value attitude to creativity and innovation. Anyway, thank you, and I hope you enjoy the module.